Mr. Herophilus in 300 BC found a C-shaped organ in the abdomen. He called it Duodenogenic, cause it was roughly 12 fingers long. Mr. Herophilus in 300 BC found a C-shaped organ in the abdomen. He called it Duodenogenic. Well, it can be defined as the most fixed part of the intestine. Interesting. Duodenum. Duodenum. So guys, let's get the party started with the next lecture. This one's on duodenum. It's going to be a long lecture, so I thought I should probably start off with an uplifting number. Right. Now remember, duodenum is mostly complicated because of its multiple relations. So I want you to be really paying attention when I speak about relations, and you might have to watch it a couple of times to understand what exactly is happening. If anybody asks you the relation status of the duodenum, you're going to say it's complicated. Ouch, that was really bad. Okay, let's move on to the lecture. Now you guys know about the proforma of an abdominal organ, so take your time and just internalize that. In case of the duodenum in relations, we're going to actually divide it into its 4 parts and then speak of the relations of every part individually, and then probably sum it up together. Okay, let's head to the lecture. So, the duodenum introduction, it can be defined as the first, the shortest, the widest, and the least mobile, or you can use the word most fixed part of the small intestine. Okay, now remember the term duodecadactylos is essentially Greek for 12 fingers long. Okay, if you've heard a word called polydactyly, dactyl means finger. You already know deca is 10 and duos is 2. So it's 12 fingers long, which makes it roughly about 25 centimeters long. Okay, and that's how it gets the name. It was coined by Herophilus or Herophilus, I don't know how to pronounce, in 300 BC. Is that important? Maybe not. Okay, next. Now remember, we already studied that the stomach in a 3-dimensional format comes out like that and then goes back in. Remember, the long axis was coming downwards and forwards, and then slightly it again went backwards. This is because the duodenum, remember, is a retroperitoneal organ, which means it is more closely adhering to the posterior abdominal wall. There is no double fold of mesentery inside which it lies, because anything that lies within a double fold actually enjoys mobility, right? But the duodenum does not enjoy mobility because it is retroperitoneal. It begins where the pylorus ends and it forms like a C shape with a concavity on the left side, and it ends to join the second part of the small intestine, that is the jejunum, at what is known as the duodenogenic flexure. Okay, now functions, you already know, is digestion. Essentially that is the breaking of complex bonds into simpler ones, and it, like I said, begins in the stomach, but by the time we reach duodenum, some serious digestion is going to take place. What do I mean by serious digestion? It means that the pancreatic enzymes are now going to act on the chyme that is being transported from the pyloric end to the duodenum, and these pancreatic enzymes join
the second part of duodenum, and we shall see the parts soon enough, in the form of a common hepato-pancreatic duct, which means there's contributions from the liver, which is gone through the bile duct, and that's basically bile, and there's contributions from the pancreas, that is the pancreatic duct. Both of these combine together and pour their respective secretions into the duodenum, and this is where the actual breaking down with all these enzymatic actions begins. Okay, let's now quickly talk about the shape, the location and extent of the duodenum. Like I said, it is C-shaped with a concavity that is facing towards the left side. So it essentially extends from L1 to L3. Remember, the pylorus was somewhere along the lower border, 1.25 centimeters to the midline. Now, the first part of duodenum has already begun, going slightly upwards and towards the right side. The first part is about 5 centimeters, after which it's going to come straight downwards, so that the third part, which is again horizontal, lies roughly along the lower border of L3 vertebra, and finally the fourth part essentially ascends upwards again to meet the jejunum at what is known as the Duodenogenic Flexure. Okay, so that's somewhere again at the level of L2 vertebra. So that's your C, extending roughly between L1 to L3 vertebra. And if you want to do the subdivisions, and we might as well get them with them right here, it has the first part, and I'm going to call that D1, which extends, as I said, towards the right and also backwards. It's kind of headed towards what is known as the right paravertebral gutter. Like the name suggests, that's just on either side of the vertebra a slight concavity, right, like a gutter that is formed. Then the second part, let's call it D2, roughly 7.5 centimeters in length, and it extends vertically downwards. It's closely related to the head of the pancreas, which will be somewhere over here. Okay, the third part extends back to the left, eventually crosses the midline and goes towards the left side. This is roughly 10 centimeters, and the fourth part slightly ascends upwards, and it's roughly 2.5 centimeters. Okay, I'm going to call that D4. Okay, so this junction is the duodenogenic flexure, and it's kind of held together by something known as a fibroelastic band. We'll study more about that. It's known as the ligament of Treitz, and it essentially just attaches from the right crust of the diaphragm, which will be somewhere over here, L1, L2, L3, and attaches somewhere to the posterior aspect of the duodenogenic flexure. That's what kind of maintains the fourth part of duodenum pulled slightly upwards. So these are the subdivisions of the duodenum. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the coolest part of the lecture, and that is the relations of the duodenum. Now, whenever I'm teaching on chalking board, I have a system. I like to construct the posterior abdominal wall of that area first. Then I like to superimpose the organ on that and then seal it off with the anterior relations. But in case of the duodenum, we are also going to do it part by part. So what I'm going to do is draw the posterior abdominal wall here, right? So let's start with the midline. I'm just going to draw it at the region of L1, L2, L3, okay? So that's the extent of the duodenum, right? Okay? That's the midline. Now on either side, I'm going to draw a couple of things. Firstly, the right crust of the diaphragm, and the left crus of the diaphragm. Okay, then the abdominal aorta, that will be somewhere over here, and the inferior vena cava, that will be somewhere over here. Okay. Now, I'm going to draw a couple of other things. Let's start with the branches of the abdominal aorta. Somewhere at the level of L1 is given off a lateral branch that is known as the left and right renal artery. Okay. Again, somewhere at a similar level, there is an artery that goes all the way to the gonads. This is known as the gonadal artery. Okay. Then, in the paravertebral area, we also have the sympathetic chain. Now, I don't know how much you know about the autonomic nervous system, but the thoracolumbar outflow that comes from the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae is carried via neurons which are going through a beaded chain that is known as the sympathetic chain. Now I'm just going to draw it on the left side for now. Okay. Now on the right side I'm going to draw the right kidney. Right kidney is approximately present at the same level, around T12 to L3. Should look something like this. And if you've seen my first lecture, Introduction to the Abdomen, then I'm sure you're familiar with the psoas major muscle that is basically arising from the transverse processes of the lumbar vertebrae on either side. Okay. So what we have constructed is the posterior abdominal wall with a couple of contents that we are going to now be discussing in the posterior relations of the duodenum. Okay. Now, first, let's superimpose the duodenum. Everybody knows lower border of L1 is the transpyloric plane, okay, and then the pylorus slightly ascends to form the first part of the duodenum, or to continue into the first part of the duodenum. About 1.25 centimeters to the right side of the midline, you've got something happening over here. Okay, then please observe that the second part of the duodenum is closely related posteriorly to the medial border of the right kidney. Okay, anterior aspect of the medial border of the right kidney, and also to the right edge of the inferior vena cava. Can you see that? Right edge of the inferior vena cava. Then we've got D3, or the third part of duodenum, going somewhere like this, and then somewhere along the lower border of L2 or at the L2 vertebral level it ascends upwards again because of the pull of the suspensory ligament forming the duodenogenic flexure. Okay, so this is the superimposed duodenum over the posterior abdominal wall. Okay, now the other amazing thing I want you to start imagining is the pylorus and the stomach. So try to understand that the lesser curvature is related to a double fold of peritoneum that is known as the lesser omentum. And the first 2.5 or the proximal 2.5 centimeters of the duodenum, or the first part of duodenum, is also embedded in this lesser omentum, in this double fold that is known as the lesser omentum, where is it going to go ahead and connect to the liver, hence it is also known as the hepatoduodenal ligament. Anyways, so point number 1, the first 2.5 centimeters of the duodenum is mobile because it is still enjoying this mobility because it is embedded within the double fold of the lesser omentum. Okay. Also understand that just lying behind this lesser omentum, okay, is what is known as the epiploid foramen. Okay. So if the double fold is here and I want to put my fingers behind it so that they come out from the posterior aspect of this blackboard, that little hole present somewhere at the level of T12 is known as the epiploid foramen. Of course, we'll have to discuss this in detail in the lecture on peritoneum. But for now, just remember that it is related superiorly to the first part of duodenum and lies posterior to the lesser omentum. Lies posterior to the lesser omentum. Okay? And also understand that the contents of the lesser omentum are from before backwards the common hepatic duct, the hepatic artery, and the portal vein. Common hepatic duct, the hepatic artery, and the portal vein. Okay, these are on their way to the liver. Now, when you trace these three structures downwards, slight changes have occurred. The hepatic artery arises from the common hepatic artery, and what comes below from there is the Gastrodonal artery. Okay, so you've got the hepatic artery here, the common hepatic here, and the Gastrodonal artery here. Okay, the common hepatic duct is joined by the cystic duct to form what is known as the common bile duct, and the portal vein is as is. So, applying the knowledge of your contents of the lesser omentum as well as reminiscing the previous lecture and understanding what really happens in this area, that is the common hepatic artery splits into the hepatic artery that goes upwards and the Gastrodonal artery that goes downwards. The posterior relations of the first part of the duodenum are the Gastrodonal artery, the common bile duct, and this is because the common hepatic duct is now joined by the cystic duct of the gallbladder, which we shall draw in the anterior relations, and of course the portal vein. These are the posterior relations of the first part of the duodenum, and these are important because they are a continuation of the contents of the lesser omentum, which is a separate question that can be asked. Now, superior relation, of course, the epiploid foramen. Inferior relation, the head of the pancreas. Okay, so relations of the first part of duodenum: posteriorly, Gastrodonal artery, common bile duct, portal vein; superiorly, epiploid foramen; inferiorly, I'm not going to write it down, head of pancreas; and anterior, we'll see towards the end. Let's talk about the posterior relations of the second part now. Again, you already have constructed the posterior abdominal wall in front of your eyes. Use your imagination. I know this has gotten really nasty now, but I'm sure you're still understanding what I'm saying. Firstly, the medial aspect or the medial border anterior surface area of the right kidney. Okay, so this was D1. Now we're going to talk about D2. Okay, I'm going to draw it here. What's that? The medial border of the right kidney. Okay, then of course the right margin of the inferior vena cava. Okay, right, I'm not writing that down. Right margin of the inferior vena cava. And hey, what muscle lies over here? Well, the muscle is psoas major. Don't forget to mention the right psoas major. These are the posterior relations of the second part of the duodenum. Okay. Now, let's continue traversing and find out what are the posterior relations of the third part. The posterior relations of the third part are, again, right psoas major, yes, of course. So I'm going to just take that again. Right gonadal artery, remember? The right gonadal artery. Okay. Then inferior vena cava and abdominal aorta, of course, inferior vena cava, abdominal aorta. Then between both of these lies the right crust of the diaphragm. Okay, the right crust of the diaphragm. And finally, do not forget this little beaded thing that I drew before. What's that? That is the right sympathetic chain. No, that is the left sympathetic chain. Okay, left sympathetic chain. So here's the relations of the third part of the duodenum. Starting from right to left, these are the right psoas major, the right gonadal artery, the inferior vena cava and the abdominal aorta, the right crust of the diaphragm, which will be somewhere over here, okay, between both of these, and the left sympathetic chain. Okay, the left sympathetic chain. You can also include the left gonadal artery if you want to, but mostly we talk about that in relation to the fourth part. Okay, mostly talk about the left gonadal artery in relation to the fourth part. Okay, now finally let's talk about the relations of the fourth part of the duodenum. One second, what are we doing? Posterior relations. So we've got, first and foremost, I think you can start saying the left psoas major. You can say it here as well, but essentially you can say it here, left psoas major. You just cross the midline, mind you. Okay, so the left psoas major, the left gonadal artery, Now remember, there is also another vessel, and I don't want to talk about it right now because it's too early in the game to speak about it, but that is the inferior mesenteric vein. Okay, inferior mesenteric vein. Right? It's going to be somewhere over here. You can also say the left crust of the diaphragm. Okay, so the posterior relations of the fourth part of the duodenum are, let's start from the top, left psoas major, yes, just on the left side of the midline, remember, left gonadal artery, yes, might as well finish left renal vessels right there, yes, the inferior mesenteric vein. Okay, now let us talk with this background in our heads about the anterior relations, and eventually what you can do is, when you watch the lecture a second time, you can just go through anterior and posterior relations of every part. Okay, I'm trying a different approach over here just because I want to know what your feedback is on this, so let me know. Correction. One thing that I forgot to talk about when I spoke about the kidney is the ureter. Okay, so in the posterior relations of the third part of duodenum, you might want to also say the right ureter, and in the posterior relations of the fourth part, you might want to say the left ureter. Okay, so I'm just going to add that over here. Left ureter and right ureter. Okay, now some textbooks mention the left sympathetic chain as posterior relation of the fourth part, but it could either be the fourth part or the leftmost aspect of the third part. So it doesn't really matter if it becomes a little here and there, as far as you understand the orientation of how the posterior abdominal wall is. Okay, so remember, I forgot to mention ureter, the right ureter as a relation of the third part posteriorly, and the left ureter as a relation of the fourth part posteriorly. Now we're gonna rub all of this and start talking about the anterior relations. Okay? I'm going to keep the duodenum intact as it is. Rub the posterior wall and try to construct what lies anteriorly. If my fourth part of duodenum was a little more closer to the midline, I think we would have been a little more precise with our orientation of the posterior relations. So I would like to apologize for that, but I'm sure that even through these mistakes of mine, you'll get to learn how everything is oriented in the abdomen. That's what it's all about. Learning from your mistakes. Okay, so I'm just gonna probably, get D4 slightly on this side now. Okay. Great. Anterior relations of B1. Now, you remember that the stomach is here. So the anterior relations of the stomach are going to be very similar to the anterior relations of D1. And the most important anterior relation on the right side of the stomach is obviously the liver, and of course in this area also lies the gallbladder. So anterior relations of D1 are the liver, but to be more precise, exactly in that area lies the quadrate lobe of the liver, which you shall study in liver. Okay, and gallbladder. Okay, that's the anterior relations of D1. Anterior relations of D2 are going to be pretty same. So you've got the liver, this time don't say the quadrate lobe though. The gallbladder, and do understand that all around over here also lies the transverse colon. So I'm going to draw that here. So you're also going to add the transverse colon, and of course the transverse colon enjoys its mobility because of something that is known as the transverse mesocolon, which is attached to the anterior border of the pancreas. Remember, mentioned that in the stomach. So that's your transverse mesocolon, and just under the colon also lies the coils of the small intestine. So you can just say coils of the small intestine. The duodenum itself is a part of the intestine, but since it's fixed and the other people, the ones that are embedded within the mesentery, enjoy mobility, it keeps on changing, right? So you always say coils of the small intestine. Okay, let's talk about the anterior relations of D3. The anterior relations of D3 is something that is known as the root of mesentery. Won't speak much about it right now, but I'm sure you understand what it means. It means the double fold that carries the jejunal and ileal loops of the small intestine. Technically, the duodenum is retroperitoneal, so it does not have to have a fold, but from here does arise the root of mesentery. It has an oblique course that looks something like this. Okay, and within the root of the mesentery are the superior mesenteric vessels. So you can say that the anterior aspect of the third part of the duodenum is related to a double fold in which is passing the superior mesenteric vessel. So the root of mesentery and the superior mesenteric vessels. Of course, you'll also have coils of small intestine over here as well. Okay, and the anterior relations of D4. Okay, the anterior relations of D4 is again going to be the transverse colon. Since it extends all across over here. So on this side you're going to have the hepatic flexure, which can be said to be a relation onto the right side of the second part, and on this side you're going to have the splenic flexure, which can be said to be a relation to the left side of the fourth part of the duodenum. Okay, great. Some of the other relations are very simple. For example, the second part of duodenum medially related to the head of the pancreas. The third part of the duodenum superiorly related to the head of the pancreas. Okay? The second part of the duodenum laterally is related to, as I said before, the hepatic flexure of the colon. The third part of the duodenum is related inferiorly to the coils of the small intestine. The fourth part of the duodenum is related on its left side to the left kidney and the left renal vessels. Okay? These are just relations to the right, inferior, superior, left. These are not very difficult to understand. So I hope you spend enough time with it and start identifying them immediately on an instinctive basis. Alright? So, now that we are done with all the relations, we're going to quickly talk once again about the posterior and anterior relations of every part. Okay? So, first part of duodenum, the posterior relations are the common bile duct, the gastroduodenal artery, the portal vein. The first part, anterior relations are the quadrate lobe of the liver and the gallbladder. The second part of the duodenum, the posterior relations are the medial border of the right kidney, the right margin of the inferior vena cava, and of course the right psoas major. The anterior relations are once again the liver, the gallbladder, the transverse colon, the transverse mesocolon, and coils of small intestine. The posterior relations of the third part of the duodenum are, as we traverse from the right to the left side, the right psoas major, the right gonadal vessels, the right ureter, then of course the inferior vena cava itself, the abdominal aorta. If you want to say, you can also say the left gonadal vessels and the left sympathetic chain, or you can just say both of these in the posterior relations of the fourth part of the duodenum. Okay? So once again, the anterior relations of the third part of the duodenum are the root of the mesentery along with the superior mesenteric vessels and coils of small intestine. Not very difficult. Finally, the posterior relations of the fourth part of duodenum. If not mentioned in the third part, please mention the left sympathetic chain, the left gonadal vessels, and do not forget this new hero who is sprung in, the inferior mesenteric vein. Okay? And the anterior relations are the transverse colon. Relations that lie superiorly to the left, inferiorly to the right is basically just a use of your imagination and shouldn't be very difficult to remember. Okay, so with that, we're done with the relations of every part of the duodenum, but this is a tough one, so you have to essentially watch the lecture the second time, and that time you can probably practice those cute little diagrams that are there in your textbook, because it's very easy to mug them up, but I want you to first understand how it all evolves through a blank slate and then start applying those cute little diagrams and practice them. Okay, now let's move on. Let's talk about the interior of the duodenum. Now, if you open the duodenum, you're going to see circular folds, which are very characteristic. And these are permanent folds, mind you, not to be confused with the temporary folds that the stomach has. They're known as rugae, if you remember. So, that's feature number one. These are known as the plicae circularis. These are also known as the valves of Kerckring, whatever the spelling is. So these are essentially going to help in increasing the surface area of absorption. Okay, and an important point is that they are not really present in the first part of duodenum. They start making an appearance when you reach the second part of the duodenum. The next important feature is what is known as the major duodenal papilla. Now the major duodenal papilla lies about 8 to 10 centimeters distal to the pyloric end. Okay, and it's somewhere along the posteromedial wall of the second part of duodenum. and it's essentially a papilla into which the hepatopancreatic duct is opening. I mentioned this before. What it is going to bring is the pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas and the bile that is produced in the liver, and together these are going to be mixed into the second part of the duodenum. Often you will also see what is known as the minor duodenal papilla. Now this might not always be present, but when present it lies about 6 to 8 centimeters distal to the pyloric end. Okay, now if present, the accessory pancreatic duct opens into the minor duodenal papilla. There's a lot of interesting things in the embryological origins of these things, so someday we'll speak about that as well. But for now, point number 4 is what is known as the arch of plicae semicircularis. Now essentially, if you open the duodenum, this is essentially cut open, okay, and you can see all these plicae circularis. Then at a certain point you're going to see a hood-like structure under which lies your major duodenal papilla. So this hood-like structure, also known as the monk's hood, is essentially the arch of plicae circularis. Now if you observe closely, just below this you will also see a vertical mucosal fold. So everything else is pretty ring-like, forming these circular folds, but in the area of the major duodenal papilla you have a couple of variations, and one of them is this little vertical fold that is known as the plicae longitudinalis. Okay, the plicae longitudinalis. So these are some of the important features that you need to remember in the interior of the duodenum. Plicae circularis, also known as valves of Bergering, absent in the first part. Major duodenal papilla, 8 to 10 centimeters distal to the pyloric end. Minor, 6 to 8 centimeters distal to the pyloric end when present. What opens here? Hepatopancreatic duct, common hepatopancreatic duct, accessory pancreatic duct, the arch, also known as the monk's hood, and the plicae longitudinalis. Now, let's talk about the suspensory ligament of duodenum, which is also known as the ligament of Treitz or Treitz. Don't know how to pronounce that. Doesn't matter. Remember, this is, that's an important word. Remember this, fibromuscular band connecting the right crus of diaphragm to the posterior aspect of the duodenogenic, and henceforth I'm just going to call it DJ. Okay? Flexure. See that? Fibromuscular band connecting the right crus of the diaphragm, the midline will be somewhere over here by the way, to the posterior aspect of the DJ flexure, and it is characteristic because its proximal third chiefly consists of skeletal muscle, its middle third chiefly consists of elastic fibers, and its distal third chiefly consists of smooth muscle. I find this very interesting. We're closer towards the diaphragm, hence probably skeletal muscle. Here we're closer towards the longitudinal muscle of the duodenogenic flexure, hence we have smooth muscle. Don't know a lot about it myself, but it's characteristic for this, and that's importantly asked. And This band is also used during surgical interventions to identify the duodenogenic flexure. It can also prove to be a radiological landmark to identify what is known as malrotation, but let's not get into details of that. So, the suspensory ligament of tribes, remember, it's important. Okay. I'm going to quickly speak about something known as the duodenal recesses, and I don't really want you to think about them right now. We could probably discuss it a little more in detail in peritoneum, but just to understand conceptually what is happening, I told you that other than the proximal 2.5 centimeters of the first part of the duodenum, most of it lies retroperitoneally, right? Now, by the time you reach the jejunal end, it is now slightly entered back into the peritoneum, as in not intraperitoneally. If you got your concepts correct, you know that nothing really pierces the peritoneum. But so it's coming back because now the remaining part of the small intestine, that is the jejunum and the ileum, are going to be embedded in the double fold that is known as the mesentery. Correct? So when it is now continuing to form the jejunum and enters the balloon, it forms certain peritoneal fossae or recesses. The first one is the superior duodenal recess. The second one is the inferior. Of course, you understand that both of these will lie superior and inferior to the duodenojejunal junction. The third one is known as the paraduodenal. And the last one is the retroduodenal. What are these? These are just little recesses that are formed. Let's call them peritoneal recesses, and their only clinical significance being they can be a potential site for strangulated herniation of the small intestine. Just remember that for now. The duodenal recesses can be a potential site for strangulated hernia of the small intestine. Okay. Now we have to move to the important part, that is the vascularization. Fortunately, the veins kind of follow the arteries. This is slightly more superficial, so I'm just going to draw the arterial supply. Now remember, embryologically speaking, and I hope you know a little bit about it by now, there is the artery of the foregut, which we discussed in the stomach, and that is the celiac trunk. Then there is the artery of the midgut, which is the superior mesenteric artery. Now I'm going to quickly just draw the descending abdominal aorta first. Somewhere at the level of T12, you had your celiac trunk, okay, and somewhere slightly below, around L1, L2, the level may vary slightly, you have what is known as the superior mesenteric artery. Okay, this is the artery of the foregut. This is the artery of the midgut. Now here's the cool thing. The duodenum partly develops from the foregut and partly from the midgut. To be precise, it is the opening of the common hepatopancreatic duct in the second part of duodenum, which acts as a junction between the foregut and the midgut. So, if this is roughly the duodenum, and this is the point or the opening where the common hepatopancreatic duct opens, then everything above this is supplied by branches of the celiac trunk, and everything below this is supplied by branches of the superior mesenteric artery. Let us see what these branches are. The first and the upper half of the second part of the duodenum is supplied by what is known as the superior pancreaticoduodenal artery. Superior pancreatico, this is where the head of the pancreas lies, remember, duodenal artery, and this is a branch of the Gastrodonal artery, which is a branch of the common hepatic artery, which is a branch of the celiac trunk. Now I don't want to go too much behind, but I hope you've seen stomach by now. You should have. If you haven't, you're a very bad person. So the common hepatic artery which gives rise to the hepatic artery going towards the liver and the gastrodonal artery. This is the gastrodonal artery, okay? And this gives rise to what is known as the superior pancreaticoduodenal artery. Now, to go a little more into detail, this immediately divides into an anterior and a posterior branch, and then there are branches that are going towards the wall of the duodenum, which are known as the vasa rectae. So, the anterior vasa rectae will supply the anterior aspect and the posterior will supply the posterior aspect. So, superior pancreaticoduodenal artery with its anterior and posterior branches via the vasa rectae end up supplying the first part and the upper half of the second part of the duodenum. Then you have the inferior pancreaticoduodenal artery, which is a branch of the superior mesenteric artery, okay, which is the artery of the midgut. So that's going to end up supplying the second half of the second part and the third part and also the fourth part of the duodenum. Again, you have an anterior and a posterior branch. The anterior vasa rectae will come and supply the anterior surface. The posterior vasa rectae will come and supply the posterior surface. The general schema of vascularization of the gut tube essentially remains the same. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the first part and the fourth part. The first part enjoys a little more privilege and it has some other arteries that are supplying it. One of them is known as the supraduodenal artery of Wilkie. Now listen, whenever there are all these scientist names or anatomist names or whatever attached to the arteries, they assume a certain amount of significance for MCQs. So always remember them. Supraduodenal artery of Wilkie. Okay? Almost always it is a branch of the gastroduodenal artery. Sometimes it might also come from the common hepatic artery, okay, and it ends up supplying the first part of duodenum. The first part of duodenum also enjoys the blood supply from a couple of branches coming from the hepatic artery and the common hepatic artery, and these branches are known as leash branches of the hepatic artery. Okay. Now, as if that wasn't enough, the first part of duodenum also has what is known as the retroduodenal branch of the gastrodonal artery. As the name suggests, the retroduodenal branch of the gastrodonal artery supplies the posterior aspect of the first part of the duodenum. Finally, we also have this little fellow, the fourth part, who also gets supplied jejunal branches, because the duodenum continues as the jejunum somewhere over here. So the jejunal branches, which are nothing but branches of the superior mesenteric artery, also end up supplying the fourth part of the duodenum. So you just might want to add that there are also jejunal branches of the superior mesenteric artery supplying the fourth part of duodenum. Got it? So the blood supply of the duodenum, the arteries are the superior pancreaticoduodenal artery and the inferior pancreaticoduodenal artery, which has anterior and posterior divisions, each of which have vasa rectae supplying respectively the anterior and posterior walls of the duodenum. Other than that, the first part of duodenum, Mr. King, enjoys supply from the supraduodenal artery of Wilkie, the leash branches of the hepatic arteries, the retroduodenal branch of the gastroduodenal artery, and the fourth part of the duodenum also gets an additional supply from the jejunal branches of the superior mesenteric artery. Please note that the first part of the duodenum, in spite of having all this privilege, ends up being most prone to duodenal ulcer because most of these arteries are end arteries. That could be asked as a nice MCQ. The veins essentially follow the arteries. So the superior pancreaticoduodenal vein is eventually going to end up emptying into the portal vein. The inferior pancreaticoduodenal vein, is going to end up in the superior mesenteric vein. Okay? Now, I do not want to speak a lot about the lymph nodes. These are known as the pancreaticoduodenal lymph nodes. Okay? And they're going to be present over here at the junction of the pancreas with the duodenum. They lie over here and they're known as the pancreaticoduodenal lymph nodes. Again, innervation probably not as important as stomach, but the concepts remain the same. The parasympathetic innervation is going to be secretomotor, so all these secretions inside the duodenum are going to be activated by vagal stimulation. The sympathetic ones arise from spinal segments T6 to T9, and they are essentially going to be carrying the pain afferents. Okay? Okay, now in the clinical anatomy of the duodenum, the first and foremost thing that you need to know about is what is known as the duodenal ulcer. Now I've already mentioned about the peptic ulcer, so this is more of a physiology topic, so I'm not going to discuss a lot, but speaking of radioanatomy, there is something known as the duodenal cap. So technically if you do a special X-ray that is known as barium meal, where barium sulfate is ingested and then photos are taken at successive time windows to see a contrast, right? So this is the stomach and this is the duodenum, okay, and this is the inner wall. There's obviously going to be the pyloric sphincter. So when barium essentially fills in this space, it presents as a narrow constriction here, of course, and then again there is a dilatation at the D1 part, right, the first part of duodenum. So this little dilatation present just above the pyloric constriction is known as the duodenal cap. Okay, and if there is going to be an ulcer in the duodenum, then this cap might start becoming deformed because the ulcer will start getting filled with the barium, right? So it leads to a malformation in the typical shape of the duodenal cap. Ideally it's mostly triangular with a distinct base. Now also remember that the duodenum, since it is retroperitoneal and more close to the posterior abdominal wall in the right paravertebral gutter, is not very prone to injuries that occur on the anterior abdominal wall. However, the third part of the duodenum, which as you saw in the relations, is sandwiched between the superior mesenteric artery anteriorly and the descending abdominal aorta posteriorly, can sometimes be sandwiched between both of these in case of a trauma, and that makes the third part of the duodenum the most prone to injury. It also makes it most prone to obstruction. Okay, finally we have the referred pain, and it's just similar to the stomach. It is a vague pain in the epigastric region for the same reasons, same spinal segments. Okay, so now we're going to speak about the pancreas. I hope that you follow through properly, fill your pre and post quizzes exactly the way they're supposed to. See you in the next one. Bye.